Thank you so much for joining our GDPR and the Boardroom webinar. Your hosts for this afternoon are Brainloop, the secure provider of corporate governance and collaboration solutions, the Chairman's Network, an international collaborative network for chairmen, board directors, and non-executives, and also Assured Data and one of their consultants, Jim Snedden. And Jim's profile is one of an industry veteran. He spent a number of years in the security industry and is an experienced practitioner around the GDPR subject matter and topic. So we're looking forward very much to what he has to say, and I'm sure you'll find it very much informative. Just going to nip back and let you know the running order for today. So after my brief comments, we'll have a very short poll. So we're just going to invite you to press a couple of buttons and let us know where you think you are on the readiness curve towards GDPR. We'll collate those results and share them back with the audience as we go. We'll then hear from Jim for up to a total of 30 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes reserved for Q&A. What we're going to do during the course of the presentations is mute all of the lines. If you could be so kind to submit your questions via the chat window in the webinar tool, or equally, if you feel more comfortable using email, please send them to london@brainloop.com. We will curate those and work through as many of those as we can. Those that we don't get to, we'll respond back to you over email. And then just another piece of information for you. This webinar is the first in a series of events in and around the GDPR topic. And you'll be able to see those following pieces of collateral and information via a variety of channels, both email and our social media platforms as well. So please follow us there, keep an eye on those, and you'll see the results of the poll there, and also some of the content from Jim's presentation, also syndicated through those channels. So hopefully for those of you that aren't so quick at making notes, and that might help, and you'll be able to catch up with content there. So yeah, with that, I think we're going to dive into the poll now. We'll leave that open for maybe a couple of minutes just to allow you all to choose the appropriate answer. I can see people are going ahead and answering those now, so that's great. Thank you so much. And then in just a moment, I'll hand over to Jim, and we'll get into the meat of the presentation. So poll away, and we'll be with you in a second. So I think we're going to move on in just a second. We seem to have reached a plateau at 90% of attendees who voted. So thank you so much for doing that. Interesting to see that 5% of you think you're in compliance. So you might well be looking at some email or something like that later on. Actually, that's just gone down to 4%. So yeah, changing all the time. And 16 or 17% of you feel like you're not prepared at all. So that's very honest. Thank you. And hopefully the next 30 minutes will be particularly useful for you guys. One thing I forgot to mention in the housekeeping, we will be recording the session as well, and the session will also be available, the recording will also be available via the channels that I mentioned earlier after the webinar. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Jim and listen with interest to what he has to tell us today. Jim.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time out to be with us today, and thanks both to the Chairman's Network and to Brainloop for organising this today. My name's Jim Snedden, and I'm the founder of a company called Assured Data. We specialise in consultancy and training around GDPR and cybersecurity. We are finalists in the Education and Training Provider of the Year category in the 2017 Computing Security Awards. But enough about me. What I'm going to do is move on to take you through the agenda. We're going to have a high-level overview about GDPR. I'm not going to go into it in too many details because, unless you've been living on Mars, I'm expecting you'll have heard something about the subject. So very high level. Who does it affect? What does it apply to? And what is the potential impact of non-compliance? We're going to do a few reality checks and look at organizations that have been breached and the consequences from that. But we're also going to bust a few of the myths that surround GDPR. What we'll then do is give some practical tips moving forward on how you can move towards compliance, but at low cost, because a lot of it's around processes, procedures, policies, contracts, and so on. So a lot of this just needs very little tweaking and a bit of resource, whereas you would see a lot of vendors out there offering a magic bullet where you can do everything with technology. Well, that's just not the case. Technology definitely helps, but there's much you can do without going out and spending too much. Going through that whole process, if you're doing it, why not use it for your own ends? You can bring value to your own organization, but use it for PR and marketing purposes as well. And then, of course, we'll have a session at the end where we can answer any questions you have. So the first thing I'm going to do is give the definition of a personal data breach. A lot of organizations or a lot of people believe that a data breach is just the loss of data from your organization. That's not actually the case. A personal data breach is a breach of security leading to the destruction of, loss of, the alteration of, the unauthorized access to, or unauthorized disclosure of personal data. All of these can be construed as a breach. So a legitimate employee within an organization, maybe in the, I don't know, the IT department, may have access to payroll data, and if he's not supposed to have access to that data, that in itself can be construed as a breach. So at a very high level, at a glance, what is the GDPR all about? Well, you've probably all seen the big headline grabbing figures, the 20 million euros or 4% of annual global turnover, whichever is the greater. These are now the maximum fines, whereas in the UK at the moment, it's only £500,000. So it's a significant jump. I will caveat this though, because lots of people use this to grab the headlines. However, as long as you're moving towards compliance and you're doing something, it's going to mitigate against you ever getting these high fines. It would have to be something that was really negligent or a serial offender for you to be able to get these levels of fines. And to put this into perspective, Tesco Bank had a breach about 6 months ago, and when they apply a penalty or a fine, it applies to the whole group. So it would have applied to the turnover of the Tesco group of the previous year. And if GDPR were being enforced, they would have potentially had a 1.9 billion fine, because that's 4% of their gross annual turnover of that year. Additionally, non-EU companies also have to comply with the law. It applies to any organization globally who is processing the personal data of EU residents or citizens. So under the existing Data Protection Act, we already see what are called individuals' rights. So it's the rights of the data subjects to ask for things like correction of details that are incorrect, or subject access requests access to their details. But currently, organizations can put an admin fee in place to supply those details and take 40 days to do it. Well, that's all going away. You can't charge anything for it, and you'll have 30 days. And those individuals' rights are being strengthened for things like the right to erasure or the right to be forgotten. And if you can imagine, if you've got one individual who wants you to remove all vestiges of them from every laptop, every desktop, every server, every cloud share, every file share, to do that manually would be extremely onerous. And just finding that data in the first place could be a nightmare, and you have to comply with it. It's law. So these are the sort of things that could turn around and bite organisations and be really onerous to their staff. And there's a number of other individuals' rights, such as data portability, so they can pick up their data in electronic format and potentially give it to a competitor, and you can't do anything about it. You have to supply it for free. We also see under GDPR there's changes to data breach notifications. In fact, there aren't really any at the moment in the UK and in many countries across Europe. However, it will be mandatory under GDPR. You will have up to 72 hours to report a breach to the authorities after you have discovered it. And that's going to be an eye-opener as to how many breaches actually are happening. At the moment, many are swept under the carpet. And I know in the Netherlands, I think it was in 130 days, so they've already implemented this. In 130 days, they had notification of circa 1,800 breaches, whereas the previous year, when the law wasn't in place, there were hardly any. So I think we're going to see the floodgates open. And when you do have a breach, your organisation should explain how many records were exposed, what mitigating measures did you have in place to counter the effects of that breach, what categories of data were breached, what measures did you have in place to prevent that breach, what are the potential consequences, and how can that impact the individuals. The more of that you can answer using your processes and systems and organizational measures, the more it will mitigate in the event of a breach. If you don't have any of these in place, it will go against you. So why are we talking about GDPR? Why is it so important? Well, it was just a few weeks ago that Equifax had a breach which highlights exactly, it's a really good example of why we need to strengthen our data protection laws. And it's not just them, there's many other organizations who are really lax in protecting personal data. However, I was looking at the ex-CEO who's just resigned or maybe retired, conveniently, but he was talking to Congress and he was admitting, yes, it was this was data that was got by a public portal anybody could get to. There wasn't any strong authentication on the portal, and the hackers got access to 145.5 million records through a public portal. The data wasn't encrypted, there wasn't any strong authentication, and they got to it through a vulnerability on the portal that had been known about for quite some time, and it hadn't been updated or patched. Now, why is that important? Well, that's negligence, really, and the knock-on effect of that negligence, people not doing their job properly, has meant that Equifax's shares have dropped by 30% at one point, and reading the Wall Street Journal, they believe it could go down to as much as 50%. Now, there's an impact there on 145 plus million users. Could it affect their credit ratings? Are they going to have their identity stolen? Are they going to have their bank accounts cleaned out? So it will affect them. Obviously, this will affect the shareholders, and that's going to have a knock-on effect to the organization itself, and it has done, where a number of the C-level people within the company, Chief Information Officer, CEO, Chief Information Security Officer, are now no longer with that company. So it's had a tangible impact on their livelihoods as well. But what do companies that are publicly trading do when the share prices go down? They try to recoup that, they try to make up for it for the shareholders, so they then start to streamline. And what we might see as a knock-on effect down the line is that they actually have to let staff go through this one piece of negligence. So this is why protecting personal data is of paramount importance. So going on with that, We've got the fines. We haven't seen what's going to happen to Equifax yet. We've just seen what has happened with the incident. We haven't seen any of the ongoing penalties that they'll get. However, we have seen some existing ones. So there was a record-breaking fine applied in Italy recently to some money transfer companies who were being negligent. So 11 million, even though that's not at the top end, it's not the 20 million, that will still hurt a lot of companies. So you do have the fines. That's definitely something that if you do nothing, you have to be aware of the risk. There's also the damage to brand. So we've just seen how Equifax has been affected. Yahoo was affected similarly recently. So Verizon were in the middle of a deal to buy Yahoo, and they'd agreed a price. And then it was revealed that Yahoo had a breach of over 1 billion user records. Over 1 billion user records. Actually, as it turns out now, it's been revealed it was 3 billion plus. But 1 billion user records. So suddenly that's affected existing business, it's affected the share price. Any new business is in doubt. And of course, Verizon have taken a step back and said, hey, we can't actually pay that agreed price. Because there's been a tangible impact on the business. We're going to offer you $350 million less, and that's what happened. So you've got the fines, you've got the damage to brand and the costs that can bring with it, but I think the scariest aspect of all is the legal aspect, and what I mean by that is every end user who has their data breached is entitled to compensation. That's part of the GDPR law. Now, I've heard it being bandied around that that's going to be between £100 and £200 per person on average, depending on the magnitude of the breach. And what's going to happen is these legal firms that are geared up for things like PPI, and PPI is finishing in 2019, by the way, so they're going to be geared up, ready, and going, what do we do next? They're going to look at the supervisory authorities, see who's just been fined, and they'll put out an advert saying, were you a victim of the recent Equifax breach? Call us to get a no-win, no-fee claim against them, and it will be class action suits. Now, if that happened against Yahoo, and it's on average, say, £100 per user, there's 100 billion in fines right there. So that's where I think the real cost could come from. Now, it might be that I've scared the daylights out of you, and I don't mean to. It seems like it's the end of the world. If we have to adhere to all these regulations, it's going to end business. Everybody's going to get those fines. But those are worst case scenarios. The reality is, if you actually do something about becoming compliant towards GDPR, and you can prove that and document it, and you're on a journey towards it, the reality is that you're only going to get an advisory or a bit of a ticking off, and they'll tell you this is what you need to do next, and you need to do it in this time frame. So as long as you're taking it seriously and you're doing something, it's much better than doing nothing. There's also a lot of myths around GDPR. So the fines is a good one to start with. We've just been talking about that. You won't get the maximum fine. I can guarantee that because you're sat on this call right now learning a bit more about GDPR. That means you take it seriously and you're already beginning to mitigate your risk. There are other things you'll need to do, but it doesn't actually have to cost the earth to start to move towards compliance and start to mitigate that risk. So I wouldn't worry too much about those headline fines as long as you're doing something. We also see companies saying GDPR is going to kill my business. I won't be able to do anything if GDPR comes into effect. Well, that's not the case. You can look at this in a positive way. It's a great way to clean your customer data. It's a great way to build a relationship with them. 75% of businesses, 75% of customers don't trust businesses with their information. And you can see why with the sort of Equifax breach, Yahoo, whatever, you can understand why. Well, you can use this as a way of building trust. The other thing is if you don't move towards compliance, your competitors may be, and when it goes to tenders, the one that's GDPR compliant is always going to win against the one that isn't. So it shouldn't kill business. It only concerns Europe. Well, we just touched on that. It doesn't. It's a global law for any organization in the world who is processing or dealing with European citizens or residents' personal data. There's a big thing around consent, and this is something that scares a lot of, especially marketers. I have to get consent. I can't just go and cold call people. I have to get consent. That's going to kill my business. Well, that's not actually the case. There are a number of lawful bases for processing personal data. You have contracts, for instance. That's a legal reason to process data. You can't fulfill a contract unless you process someone's data. There's also legitimate interest. That's where both parties have a legitimate interest in having that data processed for goods and services to be provided. So it's not always just end user consent. Brexit will kill GDPR? No, that's not possible. Brexit cannot happen before GDPR comes into enforcement. And even when it does, beyond that, we've got something called the UK Data Protection Bill, which not only mirrors the GDPR, in some areas, they're touting that it's going to be more stringent. They're actually going to hold people who are liable within the organisation legally liable. So it won't just be fines and penalties, it will be criminal liability. That's not in final draft yet, so that's just being proposed at the moment. But it won't go away, that's for sure. We also hear that everybody thinks they have to appoint a data protection officer. That's not actually the case. It's only the public sector, organisations that engage in large-scale monitoring of individuals, or organisations that engage in large-scale processing of sensitive personal data. And when I say sensitive personal data, I mean things like health data, data around ethnicity, sexual orientation, trade union affiliations, this sort of thing. So sensitive data in effect is any data that if it got into the wrong hands, it could be used to bias towards an individual. So those are the only three areas where it's mandatory to have a data protection officer. However, that said, most organisations should have someone who's got a responsibility around the GDPR, just as a matter of best practice. We also hear that many people say GDPR is just another Y2K, it's another year 2000 thing, and it'll all blow over. Well, no, that's not the case. The Y2K thing was a point in time, it happened, and actually it was a bit of a damp squib. However, the year 2018, 25th of May 2018, when GDPR starts to become enforced, is the start point, and it's going to be ongoing from there on. Fines will start to be applied from there on in. So, time for some action. What to do next? Well, I've got a few tips and tricks to get you on the route towards GDPR compliance. We have technical and organizational measures that we use to help secure data across your estate or across your networks. I don't believe you're a very technical audience today, so I'm going to concentrate more on the organizational, but of course if you do have any questions around the technical side, please do put those in as well. So what actions should you be taking now, you and the companies you work with? So training is an absolute must. I provide face-to-face and online training. Usually you find the sort of training I provide, it's the sort of thing that would be for people like yourselves and for heads of department who have a vested interest in moving forward with the GDPR projects. However, end users should also be trained, but it could be quite costly and time consuming to do that face-to-face. So you can do things like computer-based training or webinars and this sort of thing. It's the right level of training for the right people. And this is a must. The ICO, if in the event of a breach, if they came in and they learned that there were there was no training had taken place whatsoever, you would instantly go into the higher levels of the fines. So once you've done the training, you understand a bit about GDPR, what needs to be done. You would then go through a gap analysis. And again, that's something, if you have the in-house resources, they may be able to do it. Or you might go to someone and work with somebody like myself, where we'll sit down, we'll ask a number of questions of people in different departments, and we'll put together a gap analysis that shows where you're doing well, where you're doing not so well, and where you're really doing badly. From that, we'll get priorities, and I always advise to go for the high value, low cost, quick win priorities, because that will get you out of the starting blocks and on the road to GDPR at not much of a cost. So you do that gap analysis, you build a GDPR plan off the back of that, and then if you can prove that you're beginning to execute against it, it will put you in a really good place with the supervisory authorities. Another inexpensive way of moving towards compliance is look at the policies, procedures and processes that you already have in place. So you might have something like onboarding policies for staff and offboarding. If you can think about GDPR and how you can modify those to help you become more compliant as well, that's a low cost, inexpensive but very effective way of ensuring that you are dealing with personal data in the right way. i.e., if somebody's leaving the organization, you need to ensure that unless you need to keep their data, then you need to expunge that data and get rid of it. It's always a good idea, especially in the larger organizations, to get people from the different departments to understand about GDPR, look at how they're processing personal data and how it applies to the roles and jobs that they're doing, and then feed back in to an individual person who has an overall responsibility or who is coordinating the GDPR project. That way, there's no way that the people in finance will understand the challenges that the people in marketing have, for instance, and vice versa. So it's a good idea to get a representative from each to go into a sort of team leader, if you like, or a GDPR project leader, and that will help to move things forward. Also, you don't know what you don't know. So you have to go and take a look at the data flows in and out of your organization. How are you processing your staff data? How are you processing your customer data? So you do what's called data protection impact assessments. And basically that's who, what, where, why, when, and how am I processing this data? Am I accessing this data? Am I storing the data? Is it secure? A good idea is to try and build a GDPR culture within an organization, and that can work in many different ways depending on what the organization's like. So for instance, I was working with a marketing organization the other day, and they're quite sort of startup, funky, they like to have fun as they're working. And I suggested to build a culture there. Maybe they have like a parking ticket system where if you see somebody being insecure, i.e. leaving a document on a printer, a sensitive document on a printer with personal information, or leaving their laptop or desktop open, put a post-it note with a quick note on there saying, this is strike one, you've left it unlocked. And let everybody know that if they have 3 strikes, then at the end of the month, they're going to have to buy the whole team beers or cakes or whatever it may be. It's a fun way of getting a serious message across. Of course, if you're a bit of a more serious organization, it might be 3 strikes and you're out of the organization, though I would say that was probably a little bit harsh. The other thing is, and this especially applies to marketing departments, some think that quantity is better than quality. You find that people keep marketing data and indeed staff data for years and years and years, and if they're not actively using it, if it's not generating any revenue, if there's no use to it, then all it is doing is providing a risk to the organization. So if it's not being used, if it's not generating any money, get rid of it And if those are, excuse me, paper-based documents or they're on disks, you need to make sure they're disposed of correctly. You need to know where the data is that you're using and why it's being processed. You need to have a lawful reason for processing it, whether that be consent, legitimate interest, contract, or whatever it may be. But if you don't have a lawful reason for processing that data, again, you need to get rid of it. So, I spoke about the heads of departments and the people from the different business functions reporting in. Those people have a vested interest in helping your organizations to become compliant and maintain that momentum towards compliance. So I would suggest that they continue their GDPR education through seminars and webinars like today's, because things are still changing and there are still clarifications being made to the regulation. So it's a good idea for those with a vested interest just to take a bit of time, you know, a few hours every week or every fortnight, just to sort of keep abreast of things. I'd also say, where possible, classify your data. It means you can keep a track of it. It means you can ensure that the wrong types of data don't go to the wrong people, or they're not accessed by the wrong people. But indeed, if there's a data breach, you can also give the authorities that much more information because you've classified that data and you understand it. And again, if you're going to all of this time and effort, why not use it? You know, shout it from the rooftops. Hey, Mr. Customer, we're really interested and concerned about your personal data. We take it really seriously. That's why we're going through this GDPR compliance project. What that means is we're really looking after you and we want to build that trusting relationship. And of course, platforms such as BrainLoop's platform are an ideal way of securing that sort of sensitive information. So I said I wouldn't talk technical, and I won't go into technical in any great detail. However, people do make mistakes. They do take shortcuts. Excuse me. You will have seen people in the past putting post-it notes with their password onto their monitor. That's because they just want to get on and do their role. And they don't need any roadblocks or things slowing them down. They're trying to be diligent and trying to remember, you know, a 12-character password with special characters, numbers, lowercase, uppercase, and that changes every 2 weeks. It's a nightmare. So you can understand why they do these sort of things. They just want to do their job. So automation and technical solutions can help take away some of that difficulty and some of those roadblocks. So things like password managers can help with the password type of thing. Things like access controls can help ensure that the wrong people don't get access to the wrong data. Another thing I'd strongly recommend is sweat your technical assets. Believe it or not, a lot of technical people, and I come from a technical background, they love these new toys with bells and whistles, and they love to play with them. But it's unbelievable how many very expensive pieces of kit go into a network to protect it, and a fraction of the functionality is only being used. There may be encryption on there and it's not turned on. There may be data loss prevention controls on there and they're not turned on. Well, if it's already been paid for, make sure it's optimized and it's being used to the maximum before you go out and spend any money on any more technical solutions. The technical vendors out there will do their best to get you to buy the next best thing, but believe me, there's a lot of functionality that are probably already on systems that can be used. So, what would I suggest doing next? GDPR is a journey. It does seem like a long journey or a huge beast, but it doesn't mean that you'll never get to your destination. You need to at least start doing something rather than doing nothing. And it's this old saying of, you know, how do you eat an elephant? Break it down into bite-sized chunks, and that's what I would suggest. So the first thing to do, and I'm not just saying this because I deliver training. There's many organizations that deliver foundation training. I would suggest that's a great place to start for the relevant people within your organization. Do a gap analysis, do a health check of where you are, where you need to be, and look at where the gaps are. Prioritize them, go for the high value, low cost, quick wins, and that will get you out of the starting blocks towards compliance. Build a plan and then execute against the plan. Every time you do that, you're giving what's called measurable risk reduction. The supervisory authorities love to see that. Sweat the assets, sweat your technical solutions. Don't go and put budget for anything else. Get the most out of what you've already got before you do that. And again, with processes, policies and procedures and contracts, you can cover a multitude of sins and become much more compliant just by looking at some of these things and not spending extra costs. So that's it from me. I think I'm pretty much on time, and we've got to the question time.
That's great, Jim. Thanks so much. That was very interesting. Thank you. So we had a few questions come in. You talked a little bit about technology there, and you talked about a few things that might be helpful. But in general terms, we see two questions. In general terms, what's the balance between technology and process, in your view, towards achieving compliance? And then kind of the opposite question to recommending technologies, are there things that people should particularly watch out for, or practices from a technology perspective they should avoid?
Both good questions. So the initial one, technology versus process and procedures, I'd say it's an 80-20 mix, and the 80 is the processes, procedures, training, contracts, all of this sort of thing. A heck of a lot of it can be achieved through that side of things, and that's why I get a little bit frustrated, because you do get technology vendors that say, yeah, this will solve everything. Well, that's just not the case. You can get much further down the route than you would think, spending comparatively very little just by looking at processes, procedures, looking at your contracts. It might be you have to get a lawyer in to help you to change the contracts, but a few days with a lawyer is going to be much cheaper than spending £100,000 on a next generation firewall. And the second one was technology and what to look out for. Is that right?
Yeah, I think things to avoid, things that you see as common practices today that you would typically recommend people stop doing from a technology perspective.
I'd probably flip that round, and it's what people should start doing. So I alluded to it earlier. You get many people in IT departments who they're in IT. They love to play with technology. They love to code and script and do clever things, and you do see that they will buy next generation firewalls with huge amounts of functionality, and that's what all the bells and whistles make their eyes light up. But these people are typically very, very busy people, so they'll get this thing in. It will cost a lot of money, and they won't configure it to its optimum. They won't get the maximum use out of it. So consequently, you can have a number of different bits of kit. A number of them can all do the same thing, but you've got one thing doing one part of it, another one doing another part, where in reality, one thing can do all of those, look after all of those areas, and that's very common. The other thing I would say start doing regularly is patching and updating systems on a much more regular basis. This is something that traditionally has always been fall by the wayside, but it's crucial. As I say, the Equifax breach was part of that, and many breaches are through known old vulnerabilities. It's not really sophisticated new malware. It's old vulnerabilities that have been compromised.
That's great. Thanks, Jim. So we've reached the end of the allotted 45 minutes. For those who have a couple of minutes, we'll just deal with a couple more questions that have come in. Feel free to stay with us If you need to rush back to your days, we understand. And as I say, we'll follow up with answers to additional questions via the social media channels and email after the close of the call. So 2 more questions, I think. One that's come in is, how is compliance measured or policed? So obviously there's a requirement to report breaches, but are there things like spot checks? Will anybody ever find out if nothing goes wrong?
Yeah, another great question. So the ICO can do spot checks, but I think the likelihood is they won't, because they're woefully under-resourced as it is, and there's a big recruitment drive going on at the moment. What is much more likely is there'll be you have to notify if you have a breach, and if you don't do that, by the way, you suddenly go into the higher end of the fines. So there's a real incentive to do that. But either way, there's still going to be a whistleblower type culture. The ICO are encouraging people, if they spot organizations, whether you're from the inside or from the outside, if you spot an organization that's playing fast and loose with personal data, they encourage you to report it and they will investigate. The other thing is with all users being entitled to compensation if their data is breached, you're going to see that people are much sharper at the way they look at how their data is being used. They'll be looking for angles to get compensation. So I don't think inaction is an option, really.
Yep, that's great. Thank you. And then one last question. So relating to the need to report breaches, obviously you need to report it to the ICO, but do you also need to report it to all subjects affected by the breach? And is there a time limit for doing so?
Again, a great question. So if you have a breach and say the data is encrypted, for instance, if it's encrypted and you're sure that nobody else has got the keys and there's no way anybody could read that, you actually don't even need to inform the supervisory authority, because there is no way it will have a material impact to the rights or freedoms of those data subjects. That's the language that they use. However, if there's a breach and you're not really sure, then you should contact the Information Commissioner's Office or the local supervisory authority within 72 hours. And what happens is they'll work with you and look at what's happened and look at all that data you've gathered, and you'll make a decision together on, is it going to impact the individuals, and if it does, you need to inform them as soon as possible. So you do that in conjunction with the supervisory authority, the ICO, and if they deemed yes it will impact them, you need to inform them as soon as possible. Now that can be by phone, that can be by email, but it needs to be a very quick and broadcast method, so it might be on your website or whatever. Depends on your size, I suppose.
Yeah, Jim, thank you so much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Jim as well, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We're going to close the webinar now, and as mentioned, there'll be a recording that will become available, and follow BrainLoop and look at our social media channels and the emails that you've been receiving from us to catch up on answers to the other questions and the rest of the content. Thank you all again, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you very much.